If you are someone who doesn't feel like you get enough out of your stretches day to day, then this video might be for you. For so long, the way that we've asked you to stretch your tight muscles hasn't been as effective as it should be. But thankfully, there's one really simple tweak that you can make to any stretch that you do to make it instantly more effective and ultimately change how tight your tissue feels immediately. And not only that, but the technique that I'd like to show you can also be attached to other ways that we try and mobilize restricted tissue to make them more effective as well. If you're someone who does actively try and stretch your tissues in the hope of making them more supple and looser, it can be very easy to lose heart quickly because we don't necessarily feel like we're making progress over time. So ultimately what this video is about is the need to move away from static stretching towards a more dynamic, active stretch in the form of proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, or PNF, or contract relax stretching. And what static stretching has tended to be is the idea of finding a particular stretch, so in this instance a hamstring stretch, where you're up nice and tall, have a little bit of a bend in your knee, hinging forward from your hip, trying to keep your back straight, and finding a general gentle stretch through the muscle that you need to mobilize. And what we've done for so long is we've asked you to hold this position for 15 to 30 seconds, repeat that 3 to 5 times, with the view that over time, you should hopefully feel like you can eventually get further and further and further. And for me as a physio, the reason why this is a very hard technique to sustain over time is there's no immediate rewards, there's no meaning attached to this in the way that you feel it's actually doing something beneficial and you can feel the results. So what we need to do instead, and we talk about this on the channel all the time, is we need to find that same stretch, we get up nice and tall, coming forward over your hip, finding that tightness in your thigh. Then what we need to do here, which is fundamentally different, is we need to engage that tightness. So wherever you feel that tightness, you need to find a way to tense that tightness up. You might just be able to tense that muscle on its own. What you might also need to do is push back down into the ground or push back against the stretch to flare that muscle up. It doesn't matter if you just activate this in isolation or you tense everything at the same time. What we want to get you to do is we want to get your brain involved in this conversation so that when you tense that tight muscle and hold it for 5 to 10 seconds, that maximal tension is followed by a reflexive response that when we stop tensing it, the muscle physically gives and that tightness reduces to some degree, which should then allow you to immediately go further into the stretch than you could before. And then the goal with this PNF type stretching is we want to keep doing this consistently until you either get sick of it or until you stop making physiological change. It's really important to understand that the reason why this stretching technique is so effective is it engages your brain in ways that static passive stretching does not. Muscular tightness is always there for a reason. It's a response from your brain and nervous system to support or protect something, or it's an adaptation to a shape that we've consistently gotten into that might ultimately be expressing a reduced range of motion. So if you're doing any stretch, whether it's a calf stretch, a hip flexor stretch, a quad stretch, a glute stretch, whether you're stretching your chest muscles, your biceps, the back of your shoulder, even your neck muscles and back muscles, it's really important that once you've found that particular stretch, the stretch that you find valuable, the thing that you're trying to mobilize, you have to try and engage that tightness for 5 to 10 seconds, get your brain involved so that when you stop tensing it, it physically gives, then you should instantly and immediately be able to go a little bit further into the stretch than what you could before. And the really exciting thing about this is if you're already taking the time to stretch those tissues and not making progress, imagine how much more exciting this is going to be for you once you do start seeing the fruits of your labor. Now, as I said off the top of the video, if you're also using other techniques and other things to do to try and mobilize restricted tissue, say for example, you get a ball into your glutes and you're trying to find ways to sort of free that tissue up and you're sort of rolling around on it in the hope that you can sort of soften and free up some of that tissue. What you can now do instead is if you can find a particularly tight and tender area. So for most people, there should be a spot right in the heart of your buttock or your glute muscle, which is generally your piriformis, which can often be quite tight and tender, especially if you have some hidden back dysfunction. But what we can get you to do is once you've found a really good spot, instead of massaging it with the ball, you can leave the ball there and do the same thing. You can squeeze that muscle underneath, tense up the tissue, hold it for 5 to 10 seconds, and then what you should find immediately immediately after doing this. Again, once you then relax and release that, you may feel like it's not as tender, it doesn't feel as thick, maybe the ball feels like it sinks in a little bit deeper than it did before, and you've ultimately just made some improvements to that tissue in an instant. And then again, once it's relaxed a little bit and the ball sunk in a little bit deeper, you can get tight again, hold it for 5 to 10 seconds, and then again, when you relax, it'll keep softening and softening to whatever level it will get to in that moment, and then you can come back to it the next day, you can come back to it later in the day, and keep repeating that process. And the same thing applies to using a foam roller. If you're someone who likes to foam roll your ITB or your calves, for example, again, instead of trying to roll up and down, what you can do is you can find a part of your calf that feels a bit gristly, a bit thick and a bit tight. You can then tense everything up on top of that, gets your brain involved, and then guess what? When you relax it, it softens a little bit, it becomes immediately a little bit less tender, a little bit less tight straight away. You can then find the next tighter spot, get tight on top of that, squeeze everything, hold it for 5 to 10 seconds, and then relax. And again, it should consistently and continuously improve how that tissue feels immediately. So again, if you're someone who's consistently trying to mobilize your tissue through static stretching, or you're someone who never feels compelled to stretch because ultimately it doesn't feel meaningful or useful for you, try this PNF stretching technique. You should be pleasantly surprised at how instantly effective it is, and how then you may start to feel, once those tight tissues actually physically start to release, in ways that maybe you haven't been able to with static stretching. So again, let me know in the comments down below how that felt for you, and let me know if there is a muscle that you've been trying to stretch for ages that just hasn't been loosening up, and let me know if that PNF technique does assist you in some way. But once again, thanks for watching. I hope to see you next time. Bye.